You think you make logical decisions with your money. The data suggests otherwise. Let's run the numbers. A spending level can begin to feel necessary simply because it has become familiar. Budgets may follow an internal normal rather than a fresh comparison of priorities. That tension opens a puzzle about structure rather than personal failure. The distinction remains important. A raise can change the reference point before it changes long-term security. The answer begins by examining the rote around the choice, not only the outcome. This requires a careful comparison. Reducing familiar spending can feel like loss even when needs remain covered. This makes the surrounding sequence part of the decision itself. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Now, the mystery is how a relative standard starts to feel absolute. The contrast matters because preference and completion are not identical. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Reference points can quietly define what counts as enough. We can investigate the pattern while allowing responses to differ across contexts. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Past spending can become the benchmark against which every reduction is judged. The result can look like weak discipline even when the pathway carries much of the burden. Peer environments can influence what seems ordinary without creating a formal rule. This creates a practical gap between wanting an outcome and reaching it. The distinction remains important. Repeated exposure can normalize costs that once felt optional. That distinction prevents us from treating every incomplete action as a revealed preference. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Income growth can widen spending expectations before savings plans adjust. Inspect the choice architecture. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. A temporary upgrade can become a fixed baseline. Seen this way, the obstacle belongs partly to the environment. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Reference points can make flexibility harder by turning change into perceived sacrifice. The practical stakes appear when the same intention repeatedly meets the same barrier. The surrounding context still matters. Reference dependence means outcomes are evaluated relative to a comparison point. Used carefully, the concept explains a pathway rather than declaring a fixed trait. Individual circumstances can change the result. A comparison point may come from habit, peers, prior income, or recent experience. This framing preserves room for rational choice, changing circumstances, and individual variation. The distinction remains important. Absolute resources and perceived gain or loss are not the same calculation. The mechanism becomes clearer when the surrounding conditions are named explicitly. This requires a careful comparison. Adaptation can make a new level feel ordinary after repeated exposure. A precise definition prevents the label from becoming an overbroad explanation. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Lifestyle creep describes spending that expands alongside available resources. This definition keeps the analysis separate from moral judgment or guaranteed prediction. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. That pattern can be rational when priorities or responsibilities genuinely change. The distinction matters because adjacent mechanisms can produce similar visible outcomes. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Reference dependence should not be confused with simple lack of discipline. It also allows a bounded explanation without claiming that everyone responds identically. Individual circumstances can change the result. The useful question is whether the reference point still serves current goals. That boundary helps separate structural influence from personal preference. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Repeated spending establishes expectations about convenience, quality, and identity. The immediate experience may therefore outweigh a distant or less visible consideration. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Once an expectation stabilizes, a reduction can feel like giving something up. Once repeated, the sequence can become easier to follow than to reconsider. The outcome is not predetermined. Loss framing can appear even when the proposed budget remains comfortable. The practical consequence depends on timing, clarity, and the cost of reversing course. The boundary should remain explicit. Categories adapt differently because some costs become embedded in routine. This is one mechanism, not a complete explanation for every financial decision. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Interestingly, automatic renewals can preserve an old reference point without active review. The effect may strengthen when motivation is moderate and competing demands are present. Individual circumstances can change the result. Social comparison can shift the baseline by changing what appears standard. A different environment could redirect the same intention through another sequence. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. New income can be mentally assigned to upgrades before deliberate planning occurs. The relationship is conditional, which is why context must remain visible. This requires a careful comparison. Separate accounts can reinforce category-specific reference points. The pathway matters because each stage can either preserve or drain momentum. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Visible improvements are easy to notice, while avoided future risk remains abstract. This helps explain why small design features can have cumulative consequences. The boundary should remain explicit. Reference points can rise quickly and fall slowly because reductions are experienced asymmetrically. Defaults influence, they do not determine. The boundary should remain explicit. Individual circumstances can change the result. Planning from current spending may reproduce the very baseline under review. This step changes what receives attention before the final comparison is made. Individual circumstances can change the result. Starting from goals can create a different reference point for the same income. The next effect emerges because limited attention must be allocated somewhere. The distinction remains important. Temporary constraints can reveal which expenses are flexible and which are essential. That shift can alter completion while leaving the available options formally unchanged. This requires a careful comparison. A deliberate baseline can compete with an inherited baseline. The mechanism builds through several small demands rather than one dramatic event. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Reference management works by changing the comparison before evaluating the choice. This creates a pathway from environment to action without implying inevitability. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Not every increase is lifestyle creep. Some purchases reflect real utility or change needs. A rational explanation may fit better when real costs or new information are present. Lower spending is not automatically better when it reduces safety, time, or well-being. This limit prevents the concept from becoming an excuse to ignore genuine preferences. Individual circumstances can change the result. Peer standards may provide useful information rather than mere pressure. An intervention can help one person while making the process harder for another. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Adaptation can also reduce dissatisfaction after an unavoidable change. The design question must include autonomy, transparency, and who benefits. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. A strict baseline can become another unhelpful reference point. Removing burden is not automatically beneficial when reflection or protection is needed. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Different household structures make one standard across households misleading. These conditions mark the boundary between support and manipulation. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The ethical concern is avoiding shame while still examining inherited expectations. The mechanism remains useful only when competing explanations are considered. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The answer is that normal spending can become a reference point that organizes later choices. The practical lesson follows from the root, not from blaming the chooser. Individual circumstances can change the result. The reference point does not dictate behavior, but it changes what feels like gain or loss. This interpretation preserves both behavioral insight and rational exceptions. The distinction remains important. The distinction matters. A conscious baseline creates room to evaluate rather than merely continue. The final answer is therefore about alignment between intention and design. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Separating recurring needs from status upgrades can clarify which reference points matter. This resolves the opening puzzle without claiming that the environment dictates every choice. The outcome is not predetermined. Planning raises before they arrive can prevent automatic baseline expansion. The conclusion is structural but still leaves room for agency and changing priorities. The boundaries should remain explicit. Periodic reset reviews can expose expenses that no longer serve their original purpose. The decision can now be evaluated as a pathway rather than a single isolated moment. Multiple scenarios can loosen attachment to one inherited budget. That answer is stronger when stated conditionally instead of as a rule for every context. Individual circumstances can change the result. A reference point is most useful when it reflects goals, not only history. The mechanism explains influence, not destiny. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The opening trap resolves when normal is treated as adjustable rather than absolute. The opening contrast becomes understandable once the hidden comparison point is exposed. This requires a careful comparison. List which spending levels feel normal and identify where each standard came from. The action remains bounded because different contexts may require different safeguards. The outcome is not predetermined. Compare current categories with a goal-based baseline rather than only last month. The aim is to make the pathway visible enough to evaluate deliberately. The boundary should remain explicit. Decide in advance how additional income will be divided. That approach supports experimentation without promising a guaranteed financial result. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Use temporary trials to test whether a lower baseline remains workable. Engineer the environment carefully. The outcome is not predetermined. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Preserve spending that delivers clear value instead of cutting mechanically. Small revisions can be tested before they become fixed routines. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Review peer comparisons that have become invisible assumptions. The test is whether the adjustment improves clarity while preserving meaningful choice. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Separate emotional discomfort from evidence that a change is genuinely harmful. A useful change should reduce avoidable burden without hiding trade-offs. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundaries should remain explicit. Build a budget around priorities, then let the reference point follow. This turns the concept into a review process rather than a single prescription for every context. The boundaries should remain explicit. The goal is not lasting austerity, but a baseline chosen deliberately. The useful lesson is to inspect the environment before judging the chooser. Don't fight your brain, engineer your environment. See you next time.